Chances are you've heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you haven't, I'll quickly explain it. It's an effect whereby the less you know about a topic, the more confident you are that you do know about it. And the inverse of that, the more you know about a topic, the less confident you are that you know about it. And this obviously doesn't capture all topics for all people or all situations, but it is an interesting one to reflect on because it's really come into sharp effect in recent years as the internet's connected us all and you can get everyone's opinion on everything. And you can really see that someone who potentially knows nothing at all about a topic will have a strong opinion that could be completely wrong. And vice versa, the public sphere isn't filled with people declaring that they're uncertain about things or that they don't know about what's happening in certain topics. It's normally filled with people who know exactly what's occurring, which is all well and good when you're talking about the amount of weight that a bridge can take, but it's not very good when talking about what's going to happen with the future of AI. How should you raise your kids? How should you live a good life? How should we design our society or economy, et cetera, et cetera. Things that are dynamic and complex that are kind of in many ways inherently unknowable. You don't want to be listening to people who are completely certain about everything that's going to happen, but they tend to take precedence. I bring this up today because in the context of the Epstein files, it's kind of maddening to know because there is such a gap between the visible crimes and corruption of a large cohort of the top people in our society and the total lack of consequences for them and media and justice systems that are ranging everywhere from broadly ignoring to running active cover for the participants of those crimes. And it's totally crazy making to encounter that information, look at that response, and then to talk about it. And I realized that this is something that I keep coming back to in a lot of realms where just knowing about something and describing it, if there's a big gap between your conception of something and somebody else's, you can look really insane. And I was talking to Lily about why it might be the case that there hasn't been more action around the Epstein stuff in Australia, because as my patrons will know from the patron only episode, Kevin Rudd is listed in the papers as being very close and has all these odd connections to many people who are implicated, including the Norwegian ex-PM who just tried to kill himself in prison. And yet it's not really raised in Australian politics. And she said, well, I think it's the case that if you're an individual MP, you kind of look crazy for bringing up this stuff. You look like you're connected to extremist conspiracy theories and things like that. And I just realized that there are so many spheres in society that when you have the outlier information that you think should shock everything else to its core, there's kind of a collective cognitive dissonance that would rather rally around the comfort of the known orthodoxy that is the center of societies as a first reaction to new information rather than integrate that extreme stuff. And so I thought I'd go through some historical examples and present examples today for some of those outlier things, because it's an interesting phenomenon to examine and hopefully can be of some solace to you as you in your own life inevitably come across things that lead you to forming a position on what's occurring in reality that is very discordant with those around you. And also, at my most optimistic, I can hope that the folding in of certain extreme outlier perceptions of reality are inevitable and a required part of the engine of human and individual progress. That might sound a bit abstract, but we'll get into concrete stuff straight away on the other side of the music. Before we get there, thanks so much to my Patreon patrons. You do keep this show going, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you. If you have gotten any value out of one of these episodes, even once, and you've chosen to send just $3 a month, it makes an enormous difference to me. Financially, absolutely, but also just the signal that you appreciate it. It means the world and inspires me to keep on putting more effort and finding the things that are going to be interesting and hopefully helpful for us all. If you want to join that cohort, please head on over to patreon.com/Endry, ENDREY. There is a free tier where you can get a say in upcoming episodes. And I want to give a special shout out to Roberto Pestivale and Alicia, no last name provided, for becoming committed patrons in the last week. I'm glad you're enjoying the show and I hope you love this episode. It's for you. There's a great expression that comes to mind routinely to me, which is you can always tell a pioneer from the arrows in their back. And I love it because it just comes up all the time. There's something threatening about new ideas, and there's something threatening about people who reject the present orthodoxy that seems to inevitably lead to so many of the people who lead to the greatest advancements in our society, whether they're socially, technologically, spiritually, whatever it might be, that leads to their wholesale rejection from the existing society, which is really funny because you could look back at any society in human history and think, wow, wouldn't it have been great, say, in the 14th century to have an understanding that bacteria spread disease in a particular way, and here are the things you could do against that. And yet, if you were to drop in out of time with that information for people, you could probably guarantee that you would be strung up as a witch or at least laughed out of town. Because there's something about our monkey brains that wants to reject clear evidence when presented to us if that evidence threatens our shorthand perception of how the world works. One fantastic historical example, just to get us started, was Ignaz Semmelweis, who was a Hungarian physician who noticed that if you washed your hands before helping women to deliver their babies, that you could reduce the rate of infection and death of those mothers. This is in the mid-19th century, so astonishingly recent for what might sound to be a pretty obvious discovery. Discovery saw him to be ridiculed, cast out of his profession, imprisoned in an insane asylum in Vienna, and the guards beat him so severely that he died. Yet, of course, today, can you imagine having a baby delivered by an OB-GYN who didn't wash their hands? His inside offered a great service, and that's how he was repaid. And you find this story again and again and again. Not everybody's put in asylums and beaten to death, but many people are. And I think it's really important, firstly, to honor the people that do this stuff through history that are so poorly treated because of the benefit that they can lend to us, these outliers. But also, I find that their stories serve as good sort of focal point meditations to realize that the same thing is inevitably happening now as new ideas are brought to the herd, and then those who bring them are seen as a threat and outcast. And the interesting thing about this phenomenon is that you might instinctively want to explain it as, well, some people are very smart so they can see further or discover something, and everybody else is pretty dumb, so that's why they reject it. But it's not necessarily the case. And it's probably less often the case, to be honest, because the research into confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance and belief perseverance tends to indicate that resistance to new ideas and then wanting to double down and hold on to old ideas, curiously, in many instances, when you get evidence contradicting your belief, people tend to double down on that belief, which is really fun. And I'm included. This is everybody. This is you're included as well. Hate to break it to you. But it tends to stem not from a lack of intelligence, but from identity, ego, and social group alignment, when the beliefs that you hold are tied to self-concept or to your group identity, because admitting that you've made a mistake threatens more than just the idea. It can threaten your idea of yourself within a group or your whole identity, which is something that you unconsciously rally around to protect. And again, I've been thinking about this specifically in the context of the Epstein files, because I keep finding that if I have casual conversations with people who haven't read through them or have not been following what's occurring, I feel like ranting lunatic. I feel like I'd be completely insane and I'm off in QAnon and gone off the reservation in saying we're all ruled by lizard people or whatever. And this is just from describing what explicitly appears in clear primary source documents. And the emotional experience of that is alienating and potentially radicalizing. And the kind of cultural response to what has occurred and been revealed so far has me kind of simultaneously 50-50, assuming that there have to be big consequences to come because it's so brazen and obvious. But then at the same time, thinking, there definitely won't be anything because people prefer not to engage with the idea that there's a way in which the world operates that is not how we're taught or how we usually accept the presentation of things like political power and money and ideology, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things that I talk about a little bit more in the episode last week where I gave the context for the Epstein revelations. And actually, if you follow me on Spotify, I've been putting up a poll each week for whether or not people think that there will be consequences of prosecutions from all of this. And it seems to split 50-50, certainly yes and certainly no. Because on the one hand, we've seen the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, get away with kind of everything that would have overthrown presidents in the past. But at the same time, he's so clearly implicated not only within the network of Epstein's operations, but he's also implicated in the current crime of restricting the course of justice by using his office. One sharp listener commented under an Instagram post that I did saying what happened with the Panama Papers. And I think that that's a great analogy. To refresh your memory, the Panama Papers uncovered a huge world of criminal activity, tax evasion, network shell companies, fraud, sanctions evasion, you name it. It was all there. And with huge numbers of the most famous and renowned companies and people that you can think of, implicating also dozens of heads of state and former heads of state. And the main consequences of that, some money was recovered from tax evasion recoveries, but the main consequence of that was absolutely population zero people were arrested, and the journalist who uncovered it was exploded in a car bomb. So we have a pretty clear and recent historical example of kind of absolute zero consequences coming from huge scandals. And another one that comes to mind is the Snowden revelations. Edward Snowden, from within the belly of the beast, brought to light that our governments are spying on us by ripping all of our communications out of the air with impunity in a way that is illegal by the terms of their own operation within the US. And then, of course, if you're in other countries like Australia, where you have not even the facade of democratic accountability and mechanisms to have control over that information being grabbed or how it's used. And again, the consequences of that, it's not people rioting in the streets. It's kind of like, oh, that's terrible. Like, I'm old enough to remember in the 90s and noughties where it was shocking, the idea that the government would spy on you. I've talked about this, I think, in the podcast before, but I remember learning about it at university, and a precursor to the PRISM system that Edward Snowden revealed, called Echelon. And I talked to people about it. It was something that I learned about at university, and people would flat out not believe me, because so strong is the cognitive dissonance to think that the way in which we perceive the world as operating is the way that the world operates, that we don't want to believe that there's this nefarious stuff. And now, 20 years later, it's a sudden switch where, if you tell someone that on the street, you're kind of like, yeah, what are you going to do? Of course, the government of another country is capturing all of my information on my mobile phone that I use and whatever. Why wouldn't they? Even if there's no explicit acknowledgement of that or consequences for misuse of that. All of which is to say, if you have been feeling insane in any way of this, or talking to other people and finding that they reject your concerns about what's occurring, particularly if they're concerns that are one-to-one based on irrefutable evidence, it can be really alienating. And I think even just the pressure that it might be alienating would stop a lot of the discourse occurring around this that might otherwise happen. Like I've particularly been surprised that Senator Pocock, who is happy to be a firebrand and to take hits, to go into bat for topics against the conventional sort of shoulders to protect certain kinds of corruption, like the cartel political control of Australia's resources. He hasn't seemed to mention this stuff at all. And same with various leading journalists and things like that. And it's because you do kind of look insane. You do kind of look insane, and it is a bridge too far to leap outside of the Overton window. But this is not a conceptual thing. Like, this is to integrate the reality of what is now visible is somehow crazy. There's an old tweet I remember that said, nothing will make you sound more insane than describing some things that the CIA has confirmed done, or something like that. And so true. Just to give you an example, here's a document I saw this week. This was declassified in the 80s. And I'm reading it now from cia.gov/reading room/doc/special whatever. I can give you the link if you want, write to me. So it's not like I'm deep in conspiracy land. This is a declassified document directly from the CIA. And it's related to a project, Project Artichoke. So they're having a meeting, it's a memo, and they're discussing possible fields of exploration for use of chemicals. It is believed that specific research should be undertaken to develop new chemicals or drugs to improve known elements for use in artichoke work. A study should be made to determine what drugs are best suited for direct use on subjects along the lines of amytal and pentothal, and which drugs are best for indirect or long-range approach to subjects. This second type of drug should be one that could be administered over a considerable period of time, possibly being placed in food or water, and would either have an agitating effect, producing anxiety, nervousness, tension, etc., or a depressing effect, creating a feeling of despondency, hopelessness, lethargy, etc. This study should include chemicals or drugs that can effectively be concealed in common items such as food, water, Coca-Cola, beer, liquor, cigarettes, etc. This type of drug should also be capable of use in standard medical treatments, such as vaccinations, shots, etc. Like, if I took you aside and said, in the 50s, the CIA was already looking at ways that they could put drugs to generate a feeling of hopelessness and despondency in people through vaccinations and shots, you would, I think, fairly look at me like I was completely nuts. But this is a declassified memo from 1952. And obviously science has advanced considerably, and our technology has advanced considerably now. So who knows what they're doing now? I don't want to go off into that land at all. But when you read this stuff, it's hard to feel anything but insane, because who do you share it with? I mean, I'm sharing it here with you, my podcast episode, but I think that this is a phenomenon that's so interesting to reckon with, because we live in an outlier world at a time of incredible transition and information flow. So it's just going to be inevitable that more and more things are going to seem insane, that we're going to need to find ways to integrate them. Especially now, where we live at a time where we're kind of at a precipice, or at least a dramatic shifting in terms of the rate of change on so many frontiers, where we have, I guess, a threshold level of hubris where we pretend to know what the consequences could be of certain cultural, psychological, chemical, and even just baseline conceptual, how we understand the world shifts. And that will come with not just a raft, but a giant barge load full of unintended consequences and unpredicted backlashes that could come in shapes that will come in shapes that we don't know. And the people who identify those may be in for a really rough ride. I mean, just looking at a personal journey myself, I didn't eat meat for a decade and was a vegan for fair chunk of that, and I got really sick. And the doctors couldn't figure out why for a while because they assumed that I wasn't eating the nutrients that you need to have as a vegan. But I was taking them in spades and eating really well. And the more that I thought I was eating well, the sicker I became. I didn't have iron deficiencies or B12 or any of those problems. It was eventually floated to me that I might have a salicylic acid response. And salicylic acid is in basically all plants that we eat, but not all of them. And so I just stopped that diet and got better immediately. But notably, once I moved to Europe, the mix of foods that I had to eat kind of inverted. In Australia, I had to avoid tomatoes, paprika, wheat, I think. Like a lot of things. There were some really high salicylic acid plants that I had to avoid eating. And in Europe, I wasn't having a problem. And yet when I'm back in Australia, if I eat those foods, I have some swellings again and start to get the rumbles of trouble. And I think that what's occurring is that, I'm just one citizen and not a doctor, but I know and care about my own body more than other people will. Even you sickos out there. But my working theory now is that I was having a negative reaction to the glyphosate that's sprayed all over Australian crops left, right, and centre, but is illegal within the EU. Again, citizen journalism, this is just one person's anecdotes. But since noticing that, I've noticed a lot of Australians who have some level of that experience where there's some response to eating fresh foods or just generally heightened inflammation that they don't experience when they move to other places. And it's sort of total kook town to say that because Roundup is a product that's been used for decades and is used, all across North America and Australia and many other places. But now it's kind of coming into the center in the US where they're trying to pass legislation protecting the manufacturers of Roundup from being sued for any health implications. And that makes me wonder if there are studies that the companies have done themselves that they're suppressing that indicate that there are negative correlations associated with the use of this weed killer. Because it would make sense. It's designed to blanket kill insects and weeds. Like, you don't want to be putting liters and liters of that into your body. But of course we do. And a little side note, again, take it with a bucket of Roundup because I'm not a scientist. But Australia also does have the highest rate of allergies in the world. Whatever. So if you're a small lab, say, for example, and you come up with some study that you think demonstrates that there are negative health consequences associated with consuming too much glyphosate across your life, chances are you're going to look ridiculous when you bring that out because you're the only people saying it, and there'll be a huge weight of lobbying and money against you and government regulation and, I guess the demonstrated proof of orthodoxy in that not everybody else agrees with your position. And, maybe even as you're listening to me, you think, well, that's not true because something like that would come out and then people would be worried and take action. But there's so many examples of history. I mean, I gave the Semmelweis one, but then let me tell you the story of Claire Cameron Patterson, because this is one of the most fascinating examples of the 21st century of heroes that I think everybody should know. So Claire, he was a pioneering scientist, an American geochemist who's best known in his life for accurately determining that Earth's age at 4.55 billion years. But in his research, he stumbled across the contamination of the environment that led him to discover that atmospheric lead had increased over 300% since the 18th century. And he directly linked this to the use of lead in gasoline. Obviously, the world runs on oil and petrol is an extremely important asset and everything like that. So he faced fierce resistance in getting the message out that there was a problem with leaded petrol, but he spent decades doing it anyway. He took samples from remote places like Antarctica and Greenland and published in Nature and everything. But of course, his work was initially dismissed, but he was thankfully really tenacious and kept pushing on with this. And, he made friends along the way and other researchers, and it started to get momentum, particularly once there were studies linking the presence of lead in the atmosphere to children's cognitive development and things like that. But despite being published with his concerns in Nature in 1963, it wasn't until 1986 that the EPA banned lead in petrol. And, I remember growing up in Australia and leaded petrol being on the menu at petrol stations well into the 90s. The complete ban of leaded petrol from all service stations in the US came into effect on January 1st, 1996, which, of course, was 3 weeks after Claire Patterson had died. So it was the labor of a literal lifetime to get this off the ground, and predictably faced organized, financed campaign resistance every stage of the way. And already by the late 1990s, the blood levels in Americans of lead had dropped by 80%. So an astonishing service to do to his fellow man, but it's not the type of thing that, like, to go back to my glyphosate example, if we conclusively demonstrated that glyphosate was going to ruin everyone's brains and give people's kids disorders and gives us all cancer by 50 or whatever, you can't then assume that, we'll just stop spraying our weeds with that stuff tomorrow or next year, or we'll even have a plan to do it at all, or there won't be a large finance campaign to resist it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a reminder that I'm just picking one feather out of a flock of birds because there's any number of changes that are happening now that do have such consequential impacts. Whether you talk about microplastics, ocean pollution, Instagram on children, like Instagram on adults, whatever it might be. There's any number of those sudden changes that are going to have floating consequences that we can't predict from here, that as they start to come, may come from corners that are discordant with our worldview, or they come from people that we're not naturally sympathetic to, or from ideologies that we don't like. And I guess the sort of koan from it all is to take an extra split moment to think about why we're dismissing information, or to look at what information we might want to give extra credence to, given the inevitable plausibility that, as I said, there will be large scale, very outlier consequences that will come from the corner of a small voice that will seem insane at first. And to bring us back to the Epstein files, I think it's 3 and a bit weeks now since this latest tranche was released, and there's been the back and forth with the Department of Justice, visibly not fulfilling their brief of releasing them all, and visibly with the Attorney General Pam Bondi obstructing those who would look into them to investigate and identify more criminal activities and hope to prosecute the perpetrators. And I have a relationship to it all where not only do I increasingly feel insane when discussing it with people who haven't encountered it at all, but also I myself feel insane against my own assessment of reality by looking at it. And I kind of have to come back to a few touchstone pieces of information to remind me, oh no, because some of the obvious implications are so nefarious and so out of step with how even I, someone who thinks of themselves as relatively backgrounded on different ways that the world can work, have still been so shocking that I need to remind myself that when I'm looking at footage of Epstein, and he's having a normal conversation, and people will take that out of context and say, oh, they're talking about how to sell babies to Satan or whatever it is. And I'm like, yeah, actually this guy's just a normal guy making jokes, and okay, he had money and whatever. But then I'm like, oh no, he had terabytes and terabytes of child sexual abuse material, and he's good friends with basically everybody you've ever heard of, with many lines that implicate so many people to nefarious deeds by virtue of the fact that they're all resigning now. And I don't think it's because of a shaming campaign. I mean, as I mentioned, the ex-Norwegian Prime Minister unsuccessfully tried to kill himself in prison. People with power fight very hard to get into the positions that they have and for the power that they wield. They don't happily just throw them away for nothing. And it seems very obvious that there's a lot more that is yet to be uncovered. And if this is how I feel, just 3 weeks after reading it, this engagement with reality, what's true, or can that be true? Or no, I've got to remind myself that's the case. I have, I guess, an even new level of sympathy with what the poor victims of Epstein and those within his network have gone through to have held this information. This is the classic story for so many victims of sexual abuse, but in many cases have held this for decades, and you can see the contempt with which they've been treated by the police and the FBI and the governments and of course the perpetrators in a way that has me astonished that there are still so many of them who have managed to keep it together and want to be involved in pursuing justice against those who have wronged them. It's genuinely inspirational stuff. And I'm really glad that there's at least some small cohort of people within the US systems of power that are willing to put their careers and necks out to prosecute these people. When that will happen remains to be seen. But for my part, I hope that it offers some small window of comradeship or solidarity or something to have a space where we're exploring this, not just on our own. And in fact, on that topic, I'm going to do another episode this week where I go through some of the files that we all may have missed that reveal different things about the world that we might not have otherwise noticed. And I'm really curious to hear if there's anything for you that's come up from this episode that sort of screams, oh yes, I've always thought that XYZ, I've always thought that vampires are actually real and that they run Australia Post or whatever, like whatever it might be. If there is something that's like that, please get in touch, because I suppose I have a renewed energy for exploring things that are instinctively dismissed, knowing full well now that we do have this instinct, and that also some of the greatest jewels that we can have, not only in our collective understanding of what's occurring in society, but in our own lives. It could be the smallest thing that we dismiss that may be the most important thing that we need to hear. But even if you're not sitting on a jewel like that, please still feel free to get in touch, because I love to hear from all of you. And even if you're just a passive consumer, thanks so much for joining me and listening. I'll be with you again next week. Patrons, I'll be with you later this weekend. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other out there. Speak soon.